I tell people that Luke 23 is one of the most interesting chapters in the gospel. This is because in many different scenes, there are opportunities to think through the variety of actions that Jesus has engendered. For example, let me take one that isn't obvious, that isn't a character in the traditional sense of the term, but creation. Creation reacts to Jesus' crucifixion by going dark. And earlier on, as Jesus was coming into the city and people were complaining that Jesus was presenting himself as a king, Jesus responded by saying, "If my disciples don't talk, even these stones will cry out." So that's an example of the type of thing that we're talking about. We have some people who stand by and they're weeping through what Jesus is going on. This is a group of women as he approaches the crucifixion. And then there are others who are complaining about what Jesus is doing, or at least have doubt about it, express skepticism, say things as we're going to see, just like one of the criminals on the cross does. Says things like, save yourself and save us. So the scene in chapter 23 isn't just simply presenting how Jesus went through the crucifixion. It's also giving a snapshot of the variety of reactions that represent the way the world responds to Jesus. And probably one of the scenes that does this in the most compact form possible is the scene in Luke 23:39 and following, which is probably known as the thieves on the cross. Or if you're driving down some highways in the United States, sometimes you'll go by a field and it will have 3 crosses hanging in the field, 2 smaller ones and then a larger one in the middle. We actually don't know what the configuration was of the 3 crosses in the field, whether Jesus was in the middle between the other 2 thieves and kind of, hearing it from both ends, or whether he was on one end listening to the other 2 who were next to each other. We don't know what that configuration was, but we do have a glimpse of the conversation that took place that represents this microcosm of the way in which people respond to Jesus. And so I'm just going to dive right into Luke 23:39, which reads as follows. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." Now, that verse doesn't catch anyone by surprise who knows the other Gospels, because the other Gospels are aware of the fact that there was a thief who derided Jesus on the cross. What Luke gives us uniquely is the other response, and it's kind of the other end of the spectrum. On the one hand, there were some people who doubted that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and so we're kind of mocking him while he was on the cross. Here he was dying, didn't look like he was going to save himself from anybody. In fact, he was going to be killed himself, and therefore he was viewed as powerless and unable to do anything from the cross. And that's the view of this first criminal. Save yourself and us. It echoes mocking coming elsewhere from some of the people who were walking by the cross and said very much the same thing. But then there's a counterpoint of view, and that's what shows up in verse 40. But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly." Now this introduces a theme that runs all through both chapters 22 and chapters 23 of Luke, and that is that Jesus has died as an innocent. Pilate was contemplating the fact that he had done nothing worthy of death, and yet he still sentenced him to the cross. Sometimes there are people who say, the Romans get off the hook here because Pilate seems to be pretty open towards Jesus, and it's the Jewish leadership that's said to be condemning him, and that's not really what happened historically, because the only way Jesus could get crucified is if the Romans sentenced him to crucifixion. All of that is mostly true, but not totally true. Because the picture is, yes, the Jewish leadership was responsible for catalyzing the fact that Jesus was going to get crucified, but Pilate is the one who finally issued the order and had Jesus crucified for sedition, for claiming to be a king that Rome did not appoint. And I like to say that Rome believes in law and order. You follow our law or we'll put you in order. And the way we'll do that is through crucifixion. And so how many of you would like to have a judge who's sitting on the bench and who says to you, "I think you're innocent, but I'm going to crucify you anyway"? That's kind of the way Pilate is portrayed in this passage. It's a reaction that almost reacts indifferently to Jesus, yet another reaction of the way some people respond to him. But this thief is different than both of those responses, both the outright rebuke and the one that teaches that Jesus is a matter of indifference. He says, I recognize that we deserve the condemnation that we have, but that's not true of this man. Look at verse 41. "And we indeed have been condemned justly. for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong," recognizing the innocence of Jesus and asking the question, "What are you doing here with us? You don't belong here." Verse 42 goes on to then have the thief who is defending Jesus address Jesus directly with a very interesting question. It says, "Then he said, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.'" Now, there actually is a little textual issue here in verse 42 that reads something like this: "Jesus, remember me when you come into your rule," your actual reign. In one sense, it's a slight difference of emphasis, but it's making the same point. And that is that this thief recognizes, amazingly, that Jesus is going to end up being vindicated, that the cross is not the end story for him, like the people who are rebuking him, and that at some point Jesus is going to come into power. And in fact, the very fact that he has the nerve to address Jesus directly by his name, when other people tend not to do that, shows this sense of intimate connection that he has with Jesus, even as they're both hanging on the cross. And the idea I think that he had is that, and it would be a very Jewish idea, would be the idea of one day there's going to be a vindication. One day there's going to be a resurrection. One day there's going to be a rule that is to come from someone who is messianic. And when that happens, somewhere down the road, I don't know when it is, I'd like to be there. That's what I think he's actually asking Jesus to do, which is why the term remember appears in the verse, because this is something that he's going to have to reflect back on sometime down the road. Then there's verse 43. This is Jesus' response. He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, the term paradise is really about a garden. Interesting, kind of return to the picture that we see in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 with Adam and Eve in the garden. And the paradise idea is the idea this is going to be a place of peace. This is going to be a place where the righteous can live and roam and live in peace and live in shalom. That's the picture of what he's promised. But the more interesting part of the verse isn't the idea of paradise, which many Jews looked forward to because they believed in a resurrection one day. But it's the idea of today. The idea that this is going to happen right now. And the picture here is probably not of the full eschatology of the Bible, that one day there's going to be a resurrection, a resurrection body, and we will be fully restored and fully glorified and present with God eternally. It's not so much that idea as the idea of you will be consciously present that God is with you, starting right now, starting as soon as you die, as we await the rest of what it is that God is going to do. And so there's an interesting phrase in the middle of the verse of the response, and it says, "You will be with me in paradise." The idea of being with Jesus and with God is at the heart of the promise. And just as he is, ironically, with him now on the cross, one day he will be with Jesus permanently in paradise. That is the emphasis of the passage. And we see the response of how Jesus welcomes and encourages someone who recognizes who he is, even as he's hanging on the cross. And then there's irony. The irony is that as he's being rebuked for saving himself and saving us, that is precisely what Jesus is declaring at the end of the passage. He is saving himself and saving this one thief who recognizes who Jesus is. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a snapshot of why Jesus is on the cross. He died for us, and he died so we could be with him.